So thank you all for joining us today. Today is Inauguration Day, the day of the inauguration of our first President of the United States of America, President George Washington. And I trust you all arrived here safely and found accommodations. As I have heard from my sister, Mrs. Van R., who is visiting from Albany, that there is not a room available within 10 miles of this city, that it is filled to capacity. So I'm glad to see you all found transportation and proper accommodation. And for our guest today, incredibly, we have Congressman James Madison, who just this morning escorted the president from his home on Cherry Street to the Federal Hall, where he will be inaugurated later today. So Mr. Madison has taken some time out of his activities today to join us. And you know, I don't usually use notes, but I have so many questions for Mr. Madison that I have written some down to make sure we don't miss any. As of course, I am just a lady and am not well versed in these issues like the law and the Constitution, so I will be asking Mr. Madison to explain those things for us. Now, Mr. Madison, welcome to New York, and how do you find our city as a Virginian?
Oh, rather different. It's such an urban environment. I'm used to my Montpelier plantation, and if any of you cannot hear me, I am not known for my oratory. So please feel free to step a little bit closer. Absolutely an urban environment. It's much different than Philadelphia, Mrs. Q.
Much different from Philadelphia, I'm sure.
Yes, there's more things out in the street.
Well, I heard from someone in my shop that you once said that New York was too eccentric to be the capital city.
Oh, that's true. I do believe it is too eccentric to be the capital of the city.
Now that you have been here a few months, have you adjusted to our eccentricities?
No, I think that'll take a long, long time.
New York is known for being a rather different creature from the other cities along the eastern seaboard, I believe. That our ways can seem a bit difficult to understand to outsiders, although they make perfect sense to us.
Oh, Philadelphia is a little neater, a little wider, a little cleaner.
A little more boring.
It's very cosmopolitan, Mrs. Q. There is a large variety of all religious denominations. We are a wonderful port city, but I still call home Montpelier, Virginia.
Of course. And something that I've had on my mind, why is it, sir, that all of the work you put into writing our new United States Constitution, did you become a congressman? Why were you not appointed by Virginia as a senator?
Mrs. Q does not hesitate in getting right to the nugget of things, does she? Well, in true frankness, I am not one to boast, but in truth, the new president to come did want me in the Senate, apparently. But Mr. Patrick Henry, our governor down in Virginia, had a different idea. So a good friend of mine, in fact, Mr. James Monroe, you probably have heard of,
yes,
is a senator now.
And Mr. Henry as well, in his great speech before the war that we just completed.
Yes, the very man who said, give me liberty or give me death, was the very man who didn't attend the convention in Philadelphia with us to write the Constitution, and when it was written, he did not favor its ratification. And then by the time it was to elect the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, he was successful in using his power to already get senators in place of his own choosing. And then my friends, family, including my father, asked for me to personally come down and lobby for myself, which is something that I dread doing and always, in some ways, have to regret, because electioneering is just not something that a gentleman should do. But in order for me to secure a place in government at all, I needed to come down and eventually promise that I would propose a Bill of Rights in the first federal Congress if they voted for me. If that's what it took, then I promised them it would work, because I had to defer the people, because I know you all know that the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people," and you all are the sovereigns of our new government. And I think that I see interested faces now that when we have the inauguration and that it is successful and complete, that you will feel empowered and happy like you have never felt before.
Well, I think I should tell our guests here today that last week, Vice President John Adams addressed the United States Senate for the very first time here at Federal Hall. And in the Morning Chronicle, he got, I think, about a one column of mention about his speech. But that same issue has almost an entire page about Congressman Madison, with an additional supplemental page about Congressman Madison, who has been working very hard to get our government moving along, specifically with the definition of tariffs, I believe, while some of the other senators and others are mostly going to parties and orating about things that no one cares about. But I must ask you the big question to get us started, sir. What kind of government have you given us?
Well, that's really quite easy, and it's probably best described by what happened after the delegates' convention was over in Philadelphia back in 1787. When it was finally done in September, the mayor's wife was in attendance, and everyone was just trying to figure out right away what had happened, because those proceedings, you know, were all closed. They were conducted in secret. The doors were closed, the windows were closed, there was a guard appointed around the entire perimeter of the Pennsylvania State House, and so the rumors had been flying for the past few months already. Dr. Franklin exited and was approached by the mayor's wife, and as I recall, she said, "What kind of government, Dr. Franklin,
Precisely.
did you give us?" And his response was, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it."
As in the Republic of Rome, which fell due to corruption?
No, madam.
Of course, a lady is not supposed to know this, but
well, Mrs. Q
excuse me.
has a way of knowing things and already understanding words that I have in my head that I haven't spoken yet. I'm not sure.
Mrs. Van R. and I were blessed to have a father who believed in educating his daughters. So we both tend, I think, at times to be annoyances to our husbands and the gentlemen around us, but please blame our father for that. If it bothers you to have educated ladies among you. In our new nation, we will have educated ladies now. So I will not, I hope, be such an oddity. So the question is, sir, do the states govern themselves, or are we governed by an overbearing federal government, as our Governor George Clinton has surmised?
Well, I would like to assure our audience here that that is not the case. That we have designed a governmental system that is balanced. It consists of 3 branches, and no one branch will usurp power from the other, because we have set it up for the branches not to cooperate, but to compete against one another, and therefore put checks upon each of the branches, not for them to overstep their bounds. So no, you mustn't worry about having an overbearing national government. And yes, states will rule in the various forms that is required at the local level. Could be the municipality, or it could be at the state level. And these are explained very well in the Federalist essays, who I happen to know Mr. JP is read number 51, in fact, already.
Which we will be discussing later.
Yes, indeed.
Number 51, my personal favorite.
I suppose.
Well then, as you know, New York will not tolerate anyone governing over us. As I'm sure you learned from our ratification convention, the sort of spirit we maintain in New York as being separate from the other states and unique in our own way.
That's part of what makes your city eccentric, Mrs. Q.
Indeed it does, indeed it does. Now, I don't think our guests realize that when you were sent to attend the convention in Philadelphia, that the intention of that convention was to shore up and repair and perfect the Articles of Confederation. Yet you and our own young Mr. Hamilton arrived with an idea of discarding the Articles of Confederation and writing a new document, which became our Constitution. And both of your delegations, I hear, turned against you and made it quite difficult for you to do your job.
Well, Patrick Henry was such, as I gave implication to before, in our Virginia, and it's your Governor Clinton here in New York that did the same here in New York. Now, I would say that to fix or perfect the Articles of Confederation is a little bit misleading, Mrs. Q. That to perfect the Articles was rather impossible. They were too weak and ineffective. So we did properly, with the Constitution, provide for the exigencies of the necessity of providing for a government that worked. And merely tinkering with the Articles of Confederation simply wouldn't do.
And
so it's more important to get the job done than to deal with technicalities.
And we will discuss later on the tour the way both of those delegations, Virginia and New York, became quite a stumbling block to the ratification of our document. So shall we begin our walk? Our next stop will be the Liberty Pole, which you can see here, and we will walk along Broadway and we will stop at the Liberty Pole. We are turning microphones on and off, so bear with us as we get into the rhythm of doing this. All right, so the ruins you see here are of our old Bridewell prison. And during the Revolutionary War, or our War for Independence, you must know that New York was occupied by the British, and American prisoners of war, soldiers, were held in this jail. Most of them died during their imprisonment in this jail, either of disease or starvation, as of course our British tyrants did not believe that anyone fighting on the side of the Americans was worth anything, that we were lower than peasants, and simply left prisoners in horrible conditions to die. And so we remember this, we keep this as a memory of the treatment of our fine soldiers at the hands of the British. Behind me is our Liberty Pole, and I should say since it's 1789 that it is the ruins of the Liberty Pole, as this was placed here in 1921. The Liberty Poles were the centerpiece of protest against the Parliament and the Crown in the years leading to the Revolutionary War. Protests about the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Siege of Boston. All of those things occurred here at the Liberty Pole. Now, as we know, one of the things that drove us to claim our independence from the Crown was their lack of allowance of our free speech. The Crown was not interested in hearing our grievances. They were not interested in addressing them or paying attention to them or even seeing them as useful in any way. And this eventually led to conditions that led to our separation. So, sir, in order to ensure a stable government moving forward, how does your Constitution ensure the right to address grievances with our governments?
Well, that's a very proper question for the time period. I was explaining to some of the gentlemen already that that is an issue that's currently on the table that I will be bringing up in the next few weeks as we get some of the immediate business taken care of, as Mrs. Q has implied, about tonnages and import tariffs and export tariffs and other things of that nature. And as I was given the opportunity to serve the citizens of this country, I promised that I would propose the Bill of Rights because the citizens demanded it during the ratification process. So many of the individualized rights, like the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and the right to petition for your grievances, I assure you will be on that list.
Thank you, sir. Shall we continue? Are we ready, Mr. Q? Yes. So we are now on the New York City Commons, or in City Hall Park, and in this direction, if we look, we can see a building today that is blocking our view. At the time we're talking about today, that building will be in the Hudson River. That is the shore of the Hudson River, and between us and that building is King's College. Why, our only college in New York at this time, founded in 1754 by Trinity Church, the Church of England. So King's College in your time is the oldest college in New York and is Columbia College of Columbia University. But at this time, sir, two of your colleagues who've been writing the Federalist essays were students at King's College. One, a graduate, Mr. John Jay, who is going to go on to be shortly our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and our future Treasury Secretary, who I will just note did not graduate, Alexander Hamilton, with whom you have been writing the Federalist essays. You, sir, I should tell everyone, are a graduate of the College of New Jersey, also known as Princeton, founded by our Senator Aaron Burr's father, the Reverend Aaron Burr.
Indeed. In fact, Aaron Burr was a classmate of mine coming in just 1 year after me, and we were in opposition clubs. We had
debate clubs.
We had debate clubs, and I was in the Whig, and he was in the Cleosophic Society. So we often met in debate. Very smart and smart gentleman that looks to have much promise.
Well, you know that Mrs. Burr is a longtime friend of mine, and I know the Burrs very well, and you might know that they are raising their daughter in a very unusual fashion, and that their only child, their daughter, is being raised as a firstborn son. She will be the first lady in America to be educated to the same level as a firstborn son, as a John Quincy Adams, or perhaps as a Philip Hamilton, or even as a young boy who is now a good friend of hers, Mr. Washington Irving. And these are the gentlemen who are her educational peers as children. It was a very controversial decision, and I commend Mr. and Mrs. Burr for taking on this role to show our new nation that yes, the ladies can be educated fully as can the men. So good for Mr. and Mrs. Burr. And let's continue over here. And here's Mr. Madison.
I'm strolling at my Virginia pace.
Thank you. It's all right.
Not rushed like you New Yorkers.
Yes, I know we move much more quickly than others, but you know how we are in New York. Everything is success and money. The faster you move, the more you earn. So this is the Commons, as I mentioned, and on July 9th of 1776, just a short distance to the right of me, the Declaration of Independence was read here for the very first time. By order of the Commander-in-Chief, His Excellency General George Washington, the Army was here preparing for a terrible assault on the part of the tyrannical British, and the commander simply stated that many of his men would die in defense of the document, and they ought to know what they'd be giving their lives for. And it was estimated at that time that 25,000 people were here for the reading of the Declaration that day, including the young officers, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, and the higher ranking officers in the military were all present as well. Mr. Q and I attended the reading of the Declaration at Wall Street, which is closer to our home at the City Hall. Now, the Declaration of Independence, I know in your time, you're very familiar with it, but think about us hearing it in our time. For the first time, those incredible words, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is a time, my friends, of the divine right of kings, right? Rule by monarchy. And here we have a document right here where we're standing, stating otherwise, that governments are of the people and under the control of the people. And when they do not protect the needs of the people, they should be abolished and replaced with new government. Very radical words. And you may know the story that afterwards our Sons of Liberty charged down the Broadway and destroyed the giant statue of King George III that greeted all visitors to our fine city. So much excitement over that document. So I like to think that the Declaration of Independence was a promise to us of self-government, and that Mr. Madison's Constitution is the realization of that promise. So we have the promise and then the realization in the Constitution, and isn't that so?
Indeed, but my question to you, Mrs. Q, is why is it my Constitution?
Can you hear Mr. Madison all right? You might want to come in.
Why is it my Constitution, Mrs. Q?
Everyone knows it's your Constitution, Mr. Madison.
It's the people's
that
Constitution.
You are primarily responsible for this wonderful document.
Well, to be quite honest, there were several things in the document that I'm not that pleased with. I don't think any of us that left after signing were 100% happy with the contents of that document. It was a compromise every step of the way, and what we could unite around was that it was an improvement over the Articles of Confederation. It's better to get something started that was better and more powerful, centralized, but not overbearing, Mrs. Q.
Yes.
Than to try and catch up all the time with 13 sovereign states.
Exactly.
We would only break apart in a very short time.
And it is the fulfillment of the promise. And that we do now have a government of the people, by the people, that can be changed by the people. Our founders, the gentlemen who wrote the Constitution, have given us a number of great gifts to keep us from engaging in revolution against the government in the future. The first, we can re-elect our Congress, our entire House of Representatives, every 2 years. If we do not like them, we can remove them all. What a gift. our Senate every 6 years, a third being every 2 years, and of course our president every 4 years. An assurance that we will not find ourselves in the position which we were in 20 years ago, with a government far from us, that had no knowledge of us, that did not care about us, and saw us only as a way of extracting wealth for their own corrupt aristocracy. They have given us a way to prevent that from happening. If we do not like them, we may remove them. And we should. Shouldn't we?
Yes, indeed, Mrs. Q. I'm feeling more and more like a New Yorker every moment.
And let us continue to St. Paul's Chapel. St. Paul's Chapel is the only thing we're going to see today that is fully intact from before the war. Built in 1766 and fully intact. And later this afternoon, the President's inaugural service will be held at St. Paul's Chapel. So let us go on our way. So welcome to St. Paul's Chapel. St. Paul's, as I mentioned, was built in the year 1766, and it was built by Trinity Wall Street, which is only a few blocks to the south. And one might ask, why would such a small town need two churches for the same congregation? St. Paul's is the country church for Trinity Wall Street. In the years leading up to the Great War, Englishmen who were very wealthy lived on the lower part of the Broadway, and they attended services at Trinity Church. If they were that wealthy, if one was that wealthy, one had a country home just beyond the office buildings you see here, perhaps a mile or a mile and a half away. And when you were so far out of town, you attended church here at St. Paul's, the country church. St. Paul's was built to resemble St. Martin in the Field, the country church of London. So those of you who've seen that church may recognize it. St. Martin in the Field is limestone on the outside. St. Paul's is granite brownstone, hand carved, still intact in your time, and the windows are the original windows as well. This is the back part of the church, and we are going to walk around to where General Washington, or I should say President Washington, will be entering later for his service. Let's go this way. Oh, here, we can go this way, and we'll take a stop up on the porch for a moment.
That is absolutely.
Well, I probably can relate to the condition of your bladder, Mr. P. My bilious fits are frequent, sir. Please don't remind me. I don't know how much time I have left.
No, they're not allowed. Yes. And there are fences up now to prevent that.
I'm going to go behind you there.
Yes. Now, I would like you all for a moment to look at the monument behind us. The monument was commissioned by the American Congress, I should say under the Articles of Confederation, to commemorate the first commissioned officer lost in the war with England, the New Yorker Major General Richard Montgomery, who was killed in the Battle of Quebec in December 1775. And the monument was made in France. It was shipped here to New York, assembled and placed into the altarpiece designed by the great architect Pierre L'Enfant. Pierre L'Enfant was a captain in the French regiments in the Revolutionary War and is one of many officers who decided to make a life in America after the war. He also will go on to design the first federal city, Washington City. In 1818, Montgomery's remains will be removed from the graveyard in Quebec and interred here beneath the monument. So this is to commemorate our first commissioned officer to die in the war, Major General Richard Montgomery. And we are going to walk around to the main entrance where Washington will be making his arrival later this afternoon. Oh, you know what? I'm going to stand this way. The church behind me. You may all come around.
How's everyone faring? Can you hear my low voice? I'm amazed, quite frankly, and very thankful.
This is the proper entrance to St. Paul's Chapel, as it is a waterfront church, the shore of the Hudson being only directly behind you, just past the end of the graveyard. And you can see it is a lovely country church, very beautifully done, and a symbol, of course, of that great English wealth that existed here in the city before the Revolutionary War, or War for Independence. Now, later this afternoon, President Washington, I cannot get used to his new title, will be arriving here at this entrance. He will come from this direction, and at the entrance, he will be greeted by the new rector of Trinity Church, Trinity St. Paul's, Bishop Prévost. And Bishop Samuel Prévost has a wonderful story I'd like to share with all of you today. He was originally a pastor at Trinity Church prior to the War for Independence, but his sympathies were with the rebels of this town, and he was removed from his position for being sympathetic to the rebellion. He then moved back into the Hudson Valley, where he was from, and took up arms in the militia and fought for the American cause. And after the war was finished and the Church of England no longer controlled Trinity Church then became the Episcopal Church of New York, they named Bishop Prévost the first rector of Trinity Church. And it will be his honor later this afternoon to greet the first president of the United States of America and officiate over that service. Imagine the joy he is experiencing today, having taken up arms for a cause, for a general that everyone said would lose, was nothing but a backwards farmer with an army full of useless, backwards peasants, and today will give the service for the first president to serve our nation. So a wonderful day for the president and for Bishop Prévost. Our lovely old graveyard. We're in one of the oldest spots in Lower Manhattan now, the only thing older being the graveyard of Trinity Church. And as we go out on the walkway, on your left, you're going to see the grave of someone named John Holt. John Holt, one of the finest men of our town, who has recently left us. He was a printer in the years leading up to the war and printed much of our seditious, as it was called, information. He's known as the Liberty Printer of New York, and he did print that copy of the Declaration of Independence that was used by General Washington for the reading on the Commons. As a result, Mr. Holt had a death warrant issued for him. He fled New York in 1776 and lived in the Hudson Valley throughout the war, and then returned and started a new newspaper, the New York Independent Gazette, and he has recently passed on. So as we go by, you can take a look and perhaps pay your respects to one of the greatest men in New York, the printer John Holt. Shall we?
This is cute.
I think it's quite incredible, right, to stand here where Bishop Prévost bowed to General Washington as he arrived. The Congress and the Senate all aligned here, watching him walk up the walkway as he entered the church for that service. What a great moment. Mr. Holt's grave. And we're going to stop right over here because we want to talk about the theater, and we are such a nice sized group today that we won't be able to stand at the theater. So we'll stop over here. Let's come on over. And be sure to leave enough room on the sidewalk for people to pass us. Yes. Oh my goodness. So we are now near the John Street Theater, and it was my intention for us to stand by the theater, but the sidewalk is too small. We have a nice sized group, so we'll stand here. The theater was about halfway along the block on the left, our John Street Theater, and I think this is a good time to talk about the town's social life, take a little bit of a break from the legal discussions and political discussions, but talk about society a bit. And I wonder if you know that Mr. Madison is still a bachelor.
This is, I'm so, well, yes, I'm a bachelor, but I'm available.
You know, Mr. Q and Mr. Van R have declared that there are too many bachelors here in the federal city, far too many bachelors, and they claim the reason for this, are you ready, is that the ladies are too expensive to maintain, and therefore the gentlemen have chosen instead to remain bachelors. Both gentlemen have also said the men in the federal city are too interested in how they dress, too interested in fancy manners, and are a far cry from the men who fought in the War for Independence. So I think maybe that's just our older gentlemen getting a bit grumpy in their old age. But Mr. Madison is a very interesting bachelor, and I'm sure there are many ladies in New York who would love the company of Mr. Madison.
Well, I'm sure that they would like to be assured that I would stay in New York, but I'm quite certain that they would be loath to return to Montpelier and the plantation on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains to the giant plantation life that might be rather boring for them.
Well, I think, shall I share that some of the ladies in this country, not from sophisticated cities like New York, as a New York lady would never say this, have referred to Mr. Madison in some of the most unbecoming terms.
Well, that's not unusual. We vilify everyone in the newspapers, but I'm not very large, as you can see. So somebody called me size of half a piece of soap.
I heard anchovy.
And an anchovy. I get smaller than that, in fact, though. I become a pygmy, even. I'm also supposed to be mute, cold, and repulsive.
And of course, you see, that's not true. That, of course, is not true. And I'm sure no lady in New York would have said that, at least not publicly.
There will be a lady for you when it's time.
Well, thank you, madam.
It would not surprise me if you were to marry one of the most sought-after society ladies in the city of Philadelphia.
Another prescient statement from Mrs. Q. I will never forget that, and I will hold you to that.
To be introduced to you by your old classmate, then Senator Aaron Burr.
What have you been reading? Is there something in Poor Richard's Almanac that I am unaware of?
Mr. Q, as some people know, is a time traveler.
Oh, I see.
And has clued us into some of the things that are happening in the future.
Well, then I will look forward to it.
Have you been to the theater, sir?
Oh, no, I'm much too involved with the business at hand. There is so much to be done with the government. We are bound to our duty to continue the government in the way that we promised under the Constitution of the United States.
Well, I encourage you to attend the theater, and you are welcome to attend with me, as Mr. Q will not attend the theater. You are welcome to attend with me, if nothing more than to see the airs being put on by some of the ladies in this town. Now, we recently had an article in our newspaper decrying the use of the term lady, as some of the women of this town were attending social events and being announced as lady so-and-so, lady this and that. And we were quite shocked that anyone after the war, we thought, would refer to themselves in such terms of aristocracy. And Mrs. Van R and I recently were shocked when we were attending Mrs. J's weekly banquet, Mrs. J being one of the finest hostesses in all of this town, a beautiful lady, intelligent, socially capable. Mrs. J, a fine woman. Well, Mrs. Van R were there one afternoon, and we heard the announcement that a Lady Izard had just entered. And of course, we started laughing to ourselves that another lady had entered, but we laughed even harder when we saw who she was. She is the wife of Senator Izard of South Carolina, but she is the former Miss Delancey, whose own brother commanded a royal regiment and whose own father was a terrible loyalist who was involved in the plot to assassinate General Washington. And into Mrs. J's home she strolled as Lady Izard, as if she had been a great patriot all of her life. I thought Mrs. Van R would spill her chocolate. We laughed so hard when we saw her. And then there's the other great lady who is also great in size, Mrs. Henry Knox.
Oh, yes.
General Knox, the former General Knox, who will be our first Secretary of War, who we hear has taken to wearing militarized ladies' outfits that, that look like martial outfits, and calls herself, of course, Lady Knox, although at one evening event, someone referred to Lady Knox as floating through the room as if a frigate. So, a little bit of the talk that goes on here in the city of New York among the ladies. I hear a great deal of it in my store, of course, as the ladies all come in to shop. And I also was revealing to Congressman Madison recently that not only do the ladies come into my store, but the gentlemen come into my store, of course, to buy gifts for the ladies, and not always their wives. And of course, they always ask me to please keep my discretion when the lady comes in to pick up her gift as to who bought the gift for them. So we have a bit of that going on. We also have dignitaries in New York today for the inauguration. We have a delegation from Spain, a delegation from Portugal, a delegation from Holland, a delegation from France, and dare I say, a very humiliated delegation from the court of King George III, who, as much as they are probably disliking the experience, must come to recognize our own new head of state, President Washington. And many of those dignitaries are keeping rooms down on the lower Broadway in some of the more expensive inns and boarding houses, or some of them have leased entire homes for themselves, entire mansions. So a bit of what the upper classes are about. I'm sure that doesn't interest Congressman Madison.
Well, I have rather humble abode conditions for myself, as I'm not even independently on my own yet. I have to rely sometimes on monies from my father yet. So another reason why the ladies of New York would not find me very attractive.
The congressman is renting a room in
This is my
a
only
boarding
outfit.
house.
This is it.
And renting a home in a boarding house, a very fine boarding house.
Yes, a very fine boarding.
But
Mrs.
renting a room in a
Ellsworth
boarding
is
house.
a wonderful woman.
Yes, and very well known for her hospitality and dignity.
Nothing to take away from a boarding house.
Not
really.
like some of the boarding houses behind us.
Now, Mrs. Q, you must understand that the general himself, soon to be president, when he came to Philadelphia, for example, to preside over the convention that wrote our Constitution, was intent on living with the delegation in a boarding house, not trying to bring any special attention to him until Robert Morris rather pulled him aside and said, "Sir, you are living in our home, whether you like it or not." And so out of, I suppose, being polite for the invitation, he took up a residence in the home. But he was loath to do that because from the beginning, he never wanted to put on airs.
Didn't the president ask you to find a room in a boarding house for him here?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
And
he always rented rooms, during the war. So it will be interesting to find out how the president conducts himself during his first term as our president of the United States. I happen to know from a personal basis, then I was explaining to someone in the group here that he is very conscious of everything he says,
Indeed.
everything he writes, everything he wears, and he's probably going to be a little bit nervous when standing on that balcony later this afternoon.
Well, they have established quite a household for him on Cherry Street. The Congress has leased a home there, and he has a whole collection of servants, both from Mount Vernon, I believe, and from here, who will be tending to him. The great innkeeper, Mr. Samuel Francis, is steward of the home and will be managing those servants for the president. And the president has, though, expressed that he feels he is too far out of town on Cherry Street, which is not far from where you met us, and would prefer lodgings further in the town. Now, I think it's rather interesting that you and the Congress have chosen to lease a home for Vice President Adams that is 3 miles out of town.
I don't know. Vice President Adams is not really happy in his position as Vice President Adams. He rather thinks he has nothing to do.
So he
sits
has
and
nothing
reads the
to do at
newspaper.
Richmond Hill. And shall we continue? We are going to walk next to the home that is being prepared for Mr. Jefferson, should Mr. Jefferson ever decide to depart France and return to America. We'll go this way. Oh my goodness. And let's take a left here, sir.
All right.
And we do have a few benches if anyone would like to sit. Here we are. And we do have some seating here in case anyone has difficulty standing for long periods or walking. Please feel free to sit. We selected this location specifically for those
your
of you,
comfort.
yes, who would like to sit. So behind us is the home here on Maiden Lane being prepared for Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Madison lives just a few doors away in the boarding house. And what do you think, sir? Will Mr. Jefferson ever return from France, or has he taken too much of a liking to French fashion?
I have written Mr. Jefferson many times, and he does enjoy it over there immensely. And I had a conversation with these visitors of ours already a bit about whether he would accept any position offered him by the new president. So I would proffer, being a friend of his, that he would prefer to stay in France.
Stay in France, I'm sure. I'm sure he's enjoying the ladies and their fine fashions in France, and perhaps himself has taken to dressing in the French style himself.
I'm not sure. He likes to be relaxed, and he may, in his earlier times, he did powder his hair and have a wig in his earlier years, but he rather likes to be lanky and
More relaxed
and not really adhering to any formal rules, I believe.
Well, you know, Mrs. Van R and I acquired lovely French banyans, or you might call them robes, for leisure wear for our husbands, Mr. Q and Mr. Van R. And would you believe they refused to wear them, and that they said it made them look like women? And if you could see how these two gentlemen dress on a regular basis, you would be appalled. You would not think that a gentleman of Mr. Van R's means would dress as he does. Do you know, my sister had a lovely French parlor created in their home just for her and her lady friends, so that we could all relax, loosen up our clothes and our stays and speak, and that the gentlemen are not allowed entrance into that French parlor. And one night, Mr. Q and Mr. Van R attempted to enter, as Mr. Van R wanted to show it to Mr. Q, and my sister kicked them both out, well, correctly so. They had on muddy boots, and Mr. Van R was so upset he declared, "I paid for it, I ought to get to see it." And Mrs. Van R told him, "Not necessarily, sir," and escorted both of them out and promptly closed the door. So a little bit about our husbands and our trauma with our husbands.
It sounds to me like a banyan would be something that Jefferson would enjoy, however.
There are some very nice French banyans, and we have two that are being unused if he should need one, or if any of you should need one. Now, tell us a little bit about Virginia and
my beloved state,
and how your early government of Virginia became a basis for the government that we've created now.
Well, as we were very powerful in colonial Williamsburg with our House of Burgesses and such, what is it exactly that you're referring to? Because New York is powerful, Massachusetts.
The Virginia plan.
Oh, you're talking about the plan to come to Philadelphia with?
The Virginia plan.
Well, there was certain of us that were delegates to the convention in Philadelphia, of which Patrick Henry was not one of them, and I like to work. So that's why some of these people give me these names, and why I'm perhaps not attending the St. John's Theater is because I like to prepare, I like to be thorough, I like to study very deeply and thoroughly into things. So thankfully for Jefferson, in fact, I wanted to figure out what kind of ancient governments worked. So I wrote a very large paper based on a trunkload of books that Jefferson sent to me from France, about 200 of them. I read every one, all of it, and then promptly wrote a paper, Ancient and Modern Confederacies. And then from that, I went to a step beyond to try and figure out what would be remedies to the things that caused an end to these various republics and democracies in their various futures. And that became a memorandum called Vices of the Political System. And one of my main conclusions from that, which was a list of things, number 7 in fact, was that I didn't believe that the states could control a national government. In other words, to have 13 sovereign states, it would be impossible to create a government that would be anything but 13 different individual countries, so that we needed to create a national government. I showed that to His Excellency at the time and said, if we led with this plan, which was Virginia's plan, we could take some kind of control when we got a quorum at the convention in Philadelphia and at least get a start, because many of them there were not in favor of doing anything more than revising the Articles of Confederation. So it tended to work. I gave the liberty to our governor, Edmund Randolph, in order to read them for the entire day. We discussed it for the entire day because as someone that does not have a voice that carries, and he had a higher position than me, I thought it would be more persuasive. And there it went from there. And we began our debates, and it was a series of lobbying efforts, both during business hours and afterwards.
Yes. And
except for me, if I could continue
Yes.
one bit more, the business was not over when it was over. We worked from 8 to 4, 6 days a week, with exception of maybe one 10-day break in the middle where Washington went fishing. And I took notes. I don't know if you're aware, but I took notes every single day, and I did not miss a day or a single hour of any portion of any hour of any day. So I was rather fatigued all the time, but I wanted to have a record of what I thought could be a model for a future government should it be successful. And after this afternoon, we will begin finding out.
Now, it is rumored that not only did Congressman Madison take very detailed notes about the proceedings in the convention, but that he also took notes about some of the after-hours discussions that I hear you have all agreed never to divulge to anyone in the future.
Oh, that's true. And there was one of your New Yorkers, I believe it was Mr. Lansing, decided at the ratifying convention that because the convention was over and it was signed, that they could begin divulging those details. And they leaked out in the paper, and that was not what was agreed on. Mr. Washington said very firmly, take those to your grave. Because well, we were in committee of the whole so often, which was a parliamentary technique, since we were creating something that never existed in the past in any way, shape, or form, except in general. Those are some very loud pigs squealing.
Well, without the pigs, we would have no other way to clean up the trash.
Well, that's very ingenious of you, Mrs. Q.
Well, there was just a debate in our Common Council of that very issue, that people were concerned that too many pigs are roaming the town, and dogs. But they did find a use for the pigs, that the pigs do clean up the trash, although there was some concern that the gentlemen leaving the taverns very late at night were tripping and falling over the pigs. But in the end, the pigs won, and we deal with the noise of the pigs because they do perform a service. And this is what passes for our local government. Let's talk a bit about the ratification, because although these fine gentlemen came out of Philadelphia with a document, it now had to be ratified. And it had to be ratified by at least 9 states in order to go into effect. And it was ratified by 9 states, except the 2 wealthiest, most populous, and powerful states did not ratify. And again, they were Virginia and New York, who had been in disagreement in the beginning about writing a constitution to begin with. So now Mr. Madison, Mr. Hamilton, and Mr. Jay set out to address the concerns of Virginia and New York. And you may know that there were many hostile newspaper articles written about the Constitution, and the 3 gentlemen wrote responses to to those that in your day you called the Federalist Papers, or we would call the Federalist Essays. And it's my belief that Mr. Madison's are the most eloquent of those. I have quite a bit of trouble reading the works of Mr. Hamilton, and Mr. Jay only wrote a few of those, so the majority are by Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton. And Mr. Madison expounds in his about how the government works and how it's created. And one of the things he writes about is that we know that the people drawn to serve in the government will all be corrupt, and that they will be the worst people. And he does this in my favorite Federalist paper, number 51, which has the wonderful line, "If men were angels, we wouldn't need government." And would you explain a bit of your thinking on that and how your knowledge of the corruption of men led you to create what we hope will be a system of checks and balances, a government forced to control itself?
Well, my first contribution to the essays was number 10. And we talked about a concept called faction. And that seems to be a personality trait of men where it's difficult to obtain a universal opinion that's agreeable. So, as it is the nature of man to be like that, it will always be a universal challenge. So in constructing a government, we need to create actually a competitive environment where we have our three branches of government check each other, and within those government branches, there are internal checks on each other, and then at the state level and even the municipality levels, there are checks within, such that we have what we could consider a compound republic, not a simple republic. So it's rather difficult to explain. And in the course of the convention, it was astutely noted by the gentleman how all of these intricacies could be woven together. So in the end, all of us, with the exception of a very few, thought that it was the best it could possibly be in exiting the proceedings in September of 1787.
Now, to give you an idea of just how difficult it was for these gentlemen dealing with their own state delegations, Mrs. Van R. found an interesting thing in the Virginia newspaper that she has clipped and has asked me to share with you, sir.
Oh, all right. You're going to embarrass me, Mrs. Q?
I hope not. This is from the Virginia Journal. Are you prepared, sir?
Let me take a breath. It might be my last one.
And it says, Madison, among the rest, pouring from his narrow chest, more than Greek or Roman sense, boundless tides of eloquence.
Mrs. Q, Mrs. Van R., what are you doing? You're trying to embarrass me, aren't you? The only part that I really agree with is the narrow chest part.
Well, just as an example to the sort of odds you and Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jay were up against. Now, as for the New York Ratification Convention, it was certainly a comedy of embarrassment, wasn't it? With the own anti-ratification party, the anti-federalists or Democratic Republicans, described by their own leader, Mr. Melancton Smith, as sheep dispersed among a mountain. In other words, they could not even among themselves come together to create some kind of check against Mr. Hamilton's eloquent defense of the Constitution. And didn't Mr. Robert Livingston said something quite funny too? Do you remember what that was?
Oh yes, Mr. Hamilton told me that the anti-federalists were more like children blowing bubbles with a pipe.
So this is some of the debate we had in the New York Ratification Convention, which looked to be a disaster. But ultimately, Virginia and New York did ratify the Constitution and wanted a condition, didn't they? Or shall I say a list of conditions?
Oh, yes. Over the course of all of the states, there was 200 amendments. Now, the question is, are they previous amendments? Or are they conditional amendments? Or are they recommended amendments? Now, previous amendments might need a little explanation. That's the most difficult. In other words, before we'll agree to ratify, these conditions have to be met. Or it could be, let's ratify now and we'll consider amendments after the Constitution exists. Or what the worst choice would be in my mind, and I said that I would tremble in my shoes if this were the case, was that we call a second convention and start over again from the beginning. Which, by the way, I can't say in much detail because I am sworn to secrecy to my death, but there was a particular gentleman that was already having that in mind before we signed the Constitution.
And who was that?
I can't say.
No doubt it was someone from New York. I would guess someone from New York. Now, New York did suggest some amendments that have been quite useful, as in the First Amendment, which then codified some rights we already enjoyed in New York previous to the War for Independence: the right of freedom of speech, freedom of political speech, freedom of the press, the right of freedom of association, and the right not to have to be forced to worship a religion or no government religion. Rights we already enjoyed to some degree in New York before the war commenced. But I do hear that New York submitted the most number of amendments and submitted one that gave them the right to ignore the entire Constitution if they so chose.
Yes, it was called recede and withdraw. In other words, they would ratify on the condition that if the amendments that they had suggested had not been implemented by a certain time period, that they could recede and withdraw their approval of the Constitution, which of course is a ridiculous proposition.
I'm sure many of the amendments from New York were ridiculous. I've not read them all, but I'm sure they were, knowing my fellow New Yorkers. Now, New York does have and has had a legitimate question, I believe, since General Washington was granted his commission as commander-in-chief in 1775. And some of you may remember that at that time, our Governor George Clinton wrote the general a letter asking him his intentions after the war if he were to be successful. Because I'm sure you all know that at that time, or at my time, if a gentleman leads an army and defeats a king, he is now the king. And Governor Clinton asked General Washington what his opinion of that was and what he would decide to do if he was victorious. And of course, we all know, and we'll talk about it more at Francis Tavern, that he did decline to become king. But now George Clinton is back again and has asked you in one of his anti-federalist papers what prevents our president from becoming a tyrant, and that he has command as a civilian of a national military. And what keeps him from just acquiring more and more and more power over the years, as there is no limit to his time in office. So I believe Governor Clinton's question to be a legitimate one.
Well, the Constitution, I can assure you, Mrs. Q, in Article 2, Section 1, says that the President, I was talking to Mr. JP about this, about the 4-year terms. But we also have a limitation on the military. It can only serve for 2 years. It only can have 2 years worth of funding. And such limitations are put into the Constitution such that we won't build a standing army. We won't build different things that will perhaps prompt the chief magistrate. We all believe that George Washington will uphold his promises, but what about the future presidents of the United States? That the standing armies will be of a very minimal nature, something in the order of 6,000 men, simply to protect our domestic, defense, but not have anything to do with an offensive measure to propose that we would invade or colonize any other countries. So those protections are built into the Constitution.
1989 at 2 p.m. that George Washington walked out onto the balcony of the building that stood at that time and recited the oath of office of the presidency for the very first time. A young woman standing on the balcony next door said that it was so crowded, it looked as if she could step off and walk across the heads of the crowds. Remember, this is America's first leader. There are people here from all over America and all over Europe and Britain to watch what they thought was going to be the coronation of a king, and turned out to be the inauguration of a president. So no one really understood what they were coming to see in New York until they saw it. And it was quite simple. He came out onto the balcony, he recited the address as it was recited to him by Chancellor Robert Livingston, and then he went inside and he delivered his first presidential speech that was written by Mr. Madison. And then everyone went to all the parties and balls and everything else. The building we have here today is the oldest on Wall Street, built in 1841. And since Federal Hall is not open, and we couldn't do a reenactment here, I've arranged instead for us to visit the long room of Francis Tavern, where George Washington gave his farewell address as commander, which laid the groundwork for the coming United States Constitution and presidency. So we'll go down to Francis Tavern and talk about that. Okay, let's stop over here. Okay. So this is Francis Tavern, or today Francis Tavern Museum, originally home for the Delancey family. We can all boo the Delanceys. They built it as their town mansion, built in the beautiful Georgian fashion of Holland brick originally. Those are those little yellow bricks imported from Holland. Some of the most expensive bricks you could find at the time. It was built in 1719, and by all means we know that the Delanceys never lived here. As the neighborhood became more and more commercial and wasn't fashionable, they moved further uptown and sold it to the innkeeper Sam Francis, who opened the Queen's Head Tavern, home to our Sons of Liberty. During the war, it was occupied by the British, as all buildings were, and after the war returned to Sam Francis, who on Inauguration Day is no longer running the tavern here. I think his wife may be running it because he is steward of President Washington's home up on Cherry Street. But it is known as the Francis Tavern on Inauguration Day, and the significance of the building and the room we're going to visit is the room up on the second floor, the Long Room. And this is really where George Washington laid the groundwork for what we're celebrating today, right? I mentioned that Governor Clinton wrote him a letter and said, General Washington, what do you plan to do at the end of the war if you're victorious? And General Washington wrote what we call the Citizen Soldier letter, where he said, when we took on the uniform of the soldier, we didn't put aside the citizen, and at the end of this glorious and successful campaign, we will resume the citizen and put aside the soldier. And of course, at the end of the war, he keeps his promise. So December 4th, 1783, the war is over. New York is no longer under British control. Everyone is returning. Washington and his army are here, and he sends an invitation to his remaining officers to dine with him in the Long Room of the Francis Tavern. And there he begins his first farewell address, where he wishes all of his soldiers a good life in the future, thanks them for their dedicated service, and then looks out of the window and sees that there are thousands of people on the street who would like to greet him. He then asks his officers to form an honor guard to take him through the crowd, which they do. He then boards a ship, or I should say a barge, docked behind Francis Tavern, which takes him out to his ship, which will take him on to the rest of his retirement journey, which will include Philadelphia and a shocking visit to the Congress at Annapolis, where he surrenders his battle sword, right? The symbolism of surrendering to the victors. So George Washington surrenders his sword to the representatives of the people of America, and he resigns his commission, refusing to make himself king. In response, all of the officers went and resigned their commissions as well, showing that they had no intention of creating an aristocracy in America, remembering that the officers of the British, French, and every other army at that time were the landed aristocrats, so showing they had no intention of creating an aristocratic class. Now, at the time, if you're on the other side of the Atlantic, you think the Americans have lost their minds, because the measure of how powerful your country is your military. And now the Americans have beaten the British Empire and have disbanded their military. Why, they must all be insane over here. You know, what are they doing? Well, what we were doing was laying the groundwork for what would come, which was the United States Constitution and the inauguration of George Washington, not as a king, but as a president, something they did not understand in England or on the continent, and maybe still don't understand very well today how we did that. And so I have arranged for us to visit the Long Room to end our tour. I do tours for Francis Tavern, so it's included in your ticket price. And if you'd like, let's all go in and visit that incredible room where Washington began his farewell to America at the end of the Revolutionary War, providing us with the freedoms we have today. So let's head inside. And then so this is the Long Room, where General Washington had his final meal with his officers of the Continental Army. The only firsthand account we have of that event is in the journal of Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, which is also on display in this museum in another room. And I do recommend, if you come back, that you visit the museum and see all of it. They have a wonderful collection here. And it also helps, support the museum and their effort to preserve the city's history. So it wasn't here that Washington had his final meal with his officers, December 4th, 1783, everyone going home after the war. And as we can imagine, a very emotional event. Colonel Talmadge says, that they've been together all those years, and now we're saying goodbye, thinking they may never see each other again. And that when Washington addressed them and then asked each of them to come and take him by the hand, that they all began to cry when they did so. And he said that I've served this man all of these years, and I've never seen him display emotion as he did that day. So an incredible day here in the Francis Tavern. And Mr. Madison, I believe that this will tell us what General Washington said that day.
With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and fun. I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand.
And that was all he said. And a very emotional time. He looked out of the window and saw the crowds gathered. And now, after a long 7 years of war and occupation, New York was free, and it was time for us to rebuild our nation. And today we celebrate him returning to New York in 1789 and taking the oath as the first president of the United States of America. I should also mention that while that first government was in New York, that some of the departments of the government and committees met here in some of the rooms at Francis Tavern. So it also served as a part of the government, or to serve the government as well. So very nice of Mary to invite us to experience this room today. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you. An excellent conclusion, too. It's wonderful to end here. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions about the room or Francis Tavern?
Mary is the person to ask if you have any.
Let's try the story.
Yes, Ellen.
Absolutely. We heard some ruffling the other day, and I went, nope. We do have Gotham Paranormal comes in at least once a quarter at this point. We set up machines, and we're just like, hello.
Oh, yeah.
Help.
Great.
They're not malicious, but they definitely make their presence known. I've heard kids laughing, which is my limit.
I've listened to one of your talks and presentations online, and it's a little scary.
Yeah, it's a little scary, but I know that they mean no harm. But as I do research, I'm able to find names of people who I know have died in the building. So when we do the investigations, I like to start throwing out names, and I'm like, "Is it you? Is it you?
Yeah.
Is it you?" Question?
Is the lecture from the other night still available about
It should be
New York?
up.
It was very good.
Yeah, Dr. Russler, excuse.
I recommend to everyone a lecture that, what Thursday night it
It was
was,
on Thursday night.
on what New York was like when it was the federal city. And it was very good. And if you have an opportunity to watch it, please do. It was very, very good. I really
should be
enjoyed it.
on.
He was really good.
Yeah, you can tell that he's a professor over an author. I think the tone and how you speak
He
to
was
people
so
is very
good.
engaging.
He was
Yeah.
so engaging. He seemed like such a nice guy. He was really good. Even Mr. Q. Mr. Q enjoyed it as well. And he usually doesn't watch those things with me.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, so I highly recommend it. We'll be at Francis Tavern website or
It'll be
YouTube.
on the YouTube channel that we have.
So the
all
Francis
of
Tavern YouTube channel.
And then our newest exhibition, which is opening in June, is Governing the Nation, which is about America as
Great.
its capital and the offices that lived in this building.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got stuff. There's more than a restaurant.
They have an incredible collection here of stuff.
We've got 12,000 pieces to show you guys at some point in time.
Incredible collection. Come back and support them.
Okay.
Let me put this in here. What? Oh, yeah,
There
because
we
it's
have
down here.
I knew it would warm up.
Here we go. So come on. So thank all of you for joining us today. Mrs. Van R, would you like to join us? Oh. I should just hold this here. Sure.
Sisters.
I know, right?
Thank all of you. Thank all of you for joining us today. We apologize for the various glitches along the way and hope you still enjoyed yourselves. And if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. The black street signs are colonial streets. So these are streets formed before the Revolutionary War occurred. And
Mr. P.
they exist throughout the 5 boroughs. So brown are historic districts. So this happens to be a historic district and an original district. And on the top you can see it says Francis Tavern Historic District. And they are also original streets. So you'll see some of those. And some areas you'll just see the brown street signs. Those are historic for one reason or another. And the blue and green are just the modern streets. And if you're familiar with the West Village is also an old colonial and historic district because when they laid the grid, the West Village was filled with a number of estates of influential people who did not want the grid to interfere onto their property. So the grid ends at 7th Avenue South, and as you go west from there, you're on those beautiful winding residential streets again. So that was to preserve those old estates that were on that side of what today is 7th Avenue.
I would like to say that in honor of General Washington, who asked his officers to take him by the hand, I feel a special affinity to the group that has come and made the sacrifice for the trip today. It is very touching for me that you have all come. I would love the privilege of shaking the hands of all of you that are comfortable with that as we begin the experiment that continues to be in progress. Thank you so very much to you for coming. Thank you. Yes, yes, thank you.